Hey there. Are you in high school and you are taking the ACT as your standardized test of choice? In that case, you have come to the right video because we are going to discuss experimental questions on the ACT. First, we're going to talk about what experimental questions on the ACT even are. Then we're going to talk about why you need to know about them and why you need to know where you might find them. And then lastly, we're going to discuss how this is going to impact your actual test taking strategy while you're taking an ACT. And if you're new to my universe, hi there. My name's Kristina of Ivy Lunch Test Prep. For the last 15 years, I've helped high schoolers all over the globe dramatically raise their SAT and ACT test scores and ultimately land spots at their dream colleges. You can check me out at ivylunchetestprep.com. So let's dive in. Okay, so what is an experimental question? An experimental question is a question that you, the test taker, are going to do, but it doesn't count towards your score. So if you got it right, that's awesome, but it didn't actually count towards your final score. If you got it wrong, great, because it didn't count towards your final score. Now, if we have some questions in each of these sections of the ACT and they don't even count, you might be wondering like, well, why are they making me do this? Isn't that a waste of everyone's time? No, actually, the ACT needs to try out material for future exams. And they need to do it in a way where they can reliably figure out, like, is the question really a hard? Is it a medium? Is it an easy? They're going to figure this out by how many students who actually really in earnest tried it out, got that question right or wrong. Now, before, in years past, the ACT would sometimes administer a fifth multiple choice section after the main four to students, and it would be much shorter. And then that was the experimental section. And they would try out some English passages or some math questions or, English or science, whatever they wanted to try out on various students. The problem with doing it that way was that that those questions don't count towards your score. So most students either didn't do it or they just totally phoned it in. If they totally phone it in, the ACT doesn't actually know if that passage was truly hard or if it was easy or if just people were done taking a test that day and didn't bother to actually try. So now what the ACT has done in its new 2025 and onward format is the experimental questions are in each section that you're actually gonna take. You don't know which ones they are. So by putting the questions in the sections that you're taking very seriously because you want a high score, the ACT will now get very accurate data about if a question or if a passage is like easy, medium, or hard, and then it can more accurately create future tests that are approximately the same level of difficulty and have, an appropriate scoring rubric. It's actually a win for everyone. And though there's no foolproof way to know like, oh yeah, this is the passage that doesn't count, so this is the one I'm not going to spend time doing. Like there's no way to do that. There are some clues that we can gather about which things are not going to be experimental, and therefore let's make sure that we do spend time to do them. And so what I'm going to be laying out for you in this video, we're going to go section by section. So English, math, reading, and even the optional science section, because I know many of you have to take it. And we're going to go through like, how do the experimental questions show up? And therefore, are there any clues to which ones they might be, or at least which ones they're not? And then what does that actually mean for you, the test taker, especially if you're a person who tends to run a little short on time on any of the sections of the ACT? So let's dive in. So first, let's talk the English section. So the English section on the new format ACT, as you know, it has 50 questions and you've got 35 minutes if you're a regular time test taker to accomplish this in. So these 50 questions are actually distributed among 6 different passages, but there are 2 different lengths of passage, okay? So 4 passages are going to be on the longer side. They're each going to have 10 questions, okay? Then there's going to be 2 passages that are shorter and each have 5 questions. Now, this is why that even matters. Out of the 50 questions that you are going to do on the ACT's English section, 10 of them, a full 10, are experimental. In other words, your score is only going to be calculated based on how you did on 40 of those 50 questions that you did. And the other thing is, on at least every one of the 4 real practice tests that are out there, the ones in this book, all of those experimental questions are all within a passage. In other words, they're not going to just do a random question in passage 1, and here's a couple experimental questions in passage 2, and here's a few in 3. They're not doing that. It all comes from the same passage. So, like, there's one full passage in English that is experimental and doesn't count. Now, this is why this matters for you. At least in the 4 practice tests that we have, if there are 10 questions, we only have 2 options for this, right? One is we do one of these longer 10 question passages, and one of those is experimental. Or the only other way to get 10 questions is that both of the short 5 question ones are experimental. And I have not seen any practice tests do that. This is why this matters for you. If you're running out of time on the English section, make sure that, those 2 passages that are shorter than the rest and they only have 5 questions, make sure you actually have time to do those. So that might mean you do passages out of order to make sure you have time to do those. And then make sure that you save one of the longer passages that has 10 questions as the final one you do, that if you ran out of time, that's the one you maybe bubbled in a couple guesses on. Got it? So now let's go to our second section of the ACT, and that is the math section. So the math section in its new format has 45 questions, and if you're a regular time test taker, you've got 50 minutes to do this in. Now, out of those 45 questions, only 41 of them count. So that means you have 4 experimental questions. Now, the way it works is we don't have passages in math. These 4 experimental questions, they are going to be scattered throughout this math section. They're not going to be clustered together. They're not going to be all at the end or all at the beginning or all at the middle. They are spread out. So what this means for you, if you are the type of person who maybe runs a little tight on time on the ACT's math section, is that you are not going to change your strategy on math based on these 4 experimental questions. So in other words, if you run out of time a little bit, you're probably still going to start at the beginning and maybe work in order, because the questions tend to start at the easiest and then work their way up to the hard in difficulty questions. So by answering questions basically in the order that you get them in, and then cherry picking or guessing on a few at the end that you don't have time for, which tend to be the hardest ones anyway, you're not really at a risk, because these, 4 experimental questions are scattered throughout the section. You're not really at a risk of having guessed on, 4 that count, but you spent a bunch of time in the beginning and those were the experimental ones. They're not going to be grouped and clustered like that. It doesn't really affect you so much in math, so proceed like normal. So before I move on to the third section, which is reading, I actually have a question for you, and that is, do you ever remember taking the old version of the ACT at all, and you had that 5th multiple choice section and you were like, what is this? My tutor didn't tell me about this. If so, just write it in the comments, because there are a lot of new students who maybe are new to the ACT and they never experienced that. And I think it would be kind of fun for you to tell them like what that felt like, and maybe why these experimental questions just being interwoven into the section might actually be better. While you're at it, just go ahead and hit those like and subscribe buttons. And then that way, every week when I post like the latest in SAT or ACT or college application tips, tricks, updates, and hacks, you'll be the very first to know. So now let us talk reading. The reading section in the ACT, as you know, has 36 questions in it. And if you're a regular time test taker, you have 40 minutes to accomplish this in. And as you probably also already know, we split up those 36 questions into 4 passages of equal length. Okay. And they're always in the same order. We always have fiction followed by 3 nonfiction. And specifically, It's fiction, social science, humanities, then natural science. Now, one of those passages, and we don't know which, will be a double passage where you'll have a passage A and a passage B. And so it'll ask you some questions about the first, about the second, and a few questions about how the two passages relate to each other. Now, here's how the experimental questions work in this section. A full 9 questions in the reading section are experimental and do not count toward your ACT reading score. And again, just like with the English section, they don't scatter them throughout. No, 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 no. Instead, it's a whole passage that is experimental. But here's the trick. You don't know which one it is. Okay. So there have been tests where it's been the very first one. There have been tests where it's the second or the third or the fourth. There have been tests where it's a double passage, and there are tests where it's, one of the 3 single passages. So you just do not know which of these 4 passages it's going to be, right? So this is why it gets a little tricky. So if, for example, you are one of the people who does not quite finish all 4 of your reading passages in the allotted time. Now, in the past, one of the many timing strategies that you could do is like, well, let me just spend, enough time getting 3 passages like perfect, and then I'll just guess C or D or whatever my letter of the day is for that 4th one. And for some people, like you're not going to get a perfect score doing it that way, but for some people, they actually could get a pretty solid score, like maybe a 28, 29, sometimes even a 30 doing it that way because they were so confident about the 3 that they did spend the time to actually read and complete. You can't do that anymore, right? Because we don't know which passage is going to be experimental and which 3 count. So what if you spent all of your time doing the first 3 and then you just guessed on the last one, but the experimental passage was one of those first 3 and it didn't count. So sure, you got all the questions right, but it didn't help you. And now one of the 3 remaining passages that does count and that does make up your reading score, it was the one that you just bubbled in CH for. That would really be terrible, right? So if that was your strategy before or you ever heard of that, you can't do that anymore. Instead, if you are one of the people who struggles a bit with finishing all 4 of the reading passages in the allotted 40 minutes, if you're, regular time, then what you're going to do is figure out some strategy where you do get to every passage, even if you don't maybe spend as long per passage as you would like. We have to mitigate the risk that you end up guessing on a whole passage that does count, but you spent your time doing the one that didn't count. Does that make sense? So if that means that you literally are allowing yourself 10 minutes per passage, and if that means you have to guess on a question or 2 per passage, so be it. At least you were able to really try for the other 8 or 9 questions per passage. That's going to be your best strategy here because that way you have mitigated the risk. Okay, and finally, now we have the 4th multiple choice section, which is the science section. Yes, I know it's optional now. Still, most students I'm working with are still going to do it because there might be a couple schools on their college list that might require it. And if you're a sophomore or you're a junior, maybe you don't quite know which schools you want to apply to yet, but you don't want to only do the first 3 sections and thereby not be able to apply to a school later on because you didn't have science and they do require it. So I'm still going to speak to science. The science section of the ACT has 40 questions and you have 40 minutes to do it in. So these 40 questions are broken down into 7 different science passages, but they're not all the same. We have 3 different types of science passage, and depending on which type it is, there's going to be a different number of questions per passage. Okay, so this is why I'm going to tell you about this because it factors very heavily into our strategy. Now, 2 of these passages are going to be just regular old chart and graph passages, and they each have 5 questions. Then you have one passage that is what I call a fighting scientist passage or a conflicting scientific viewpoint passage. It has 6 questions. And then you're like, wait, but I thought you said there were 7. Yeah, there are 7 passages. The remaining 4 passages are all what we call experiment passages. They have like study 1, study 2, experiment 1, experiment 2, trial 1, trial 2. Like you'll see those words in them. And each of these experiment passages also has 6 questions. So now we don't know what order they're going to put them in. They will change the order every single test. But this is what we do know. There are going to be 6, not 5, not 7, 6 experimental questions. And like the English section and like the reading section, the other sections with passages, they're not scattered throughout the science section. All the experimental questions come from the same passage. So basically, you have 7 passages, 6 count, 1 does not. Okay. And they just gave us a clue. The type of passage that doesn't count, the type of passage that is going to be experimental, has exactly 6 questions in it, right? So 34 questions out of the 40 contribute to your score, 6 do not. So now, pop quiz. Out of what I just told you, which passage types were the ones that only had 6 questions? Not the chart and graph, those had 5. So that's not going to be an experimental passage. The fighting scientist passage has 6, and those 4 different experiment passages, those each have 6 questions. Okay, so we know it has to be either the fighting scientist or one of the experiment passages. But think about this for a second. We only have one fighting scientist passage in this entire science section. Why would they make that one the one that doesn't count? They wouldn't, right? And in fact, in the 4 tests that they at least gave us, it's never been the fighting scientist passage that was experimental. That one's always counted because it's the only one. It would be unfair for an ACT test taker in October to not have the fighting scientist passage count for them, but then it counts for the person who takes it in December, because each of the passage types kind of played to different strengths and weaknesses. So what does that leave us with? You guessed it, the experimental passage pretty much has to be one of the experiments passages, okay? So this is how you're going to alter your strategy based on this if you are one of those students who tends to run out of time or is tight on time in the science section. What you're going to do is, regardless of what order they give you the science passages in, you're going to make sure that you do those chart and graph passages and the fighting scientist passage at least first, or like somewhere in the first half. Like don't wait till the end to do those 3, because we know those 3 passages, there's a 99% chance that they are going to count towards your score. So now that you've done the fighting scientist and you had ample time for that, and you had the 2 chart and graph passages and you had ample time for those, now if you're going to run out of time or you're left having to guess on a couple questions, it's one of the experiment passage questions that you're going to guess on. And there's more of a likelihood that it might be experimental and not count against you if in fact you get it wrong. So again, while this might not be perfect, there are some actionable things you can do, especially if you are the type who runs out of time on any of the multiple choice sections of the ACT. So I hope you found this super eye-opening, and I hope this little tidbit helps you raise your ACT scores. If you want even more tips and tricks about the ACT or about testing in general or about college application essays, please check out my website, ivyloungetestprep.com. I can work with you either one-on-one to help raise your scores, or if you're more of a lone wolf and like to study on your own, you can check out my courses and ebooks. Check them out in the link below.